Good afternoon and welcome to Lunchtime series where we add value to people's lives, happening every Wednesday and Thursday on ebizradio.com. You can catch the Lunchtime series on all major podcast channels today. As a proponent and advocate to climate change, if you want to help climate change and find out more about what you can do about it, Clean Creatives is calling on all agencies, PR companies and individuals to stop working with the fossil fuel industry, the brands to stop working with the agencies that continue to do so. Sign the pledge at cleancreatives.org/South Africa. Clean Creatives, the future of creativity is clean. On our show today, guys, for the coaching segment, we have the wonderful human and talented centered strategist, executive coach, agile people advocate, HR and leadership expert, Anja van Beek. Welcome back, Anja, and thank you for joining me for the coaching segment.
Thank you so much. And I'm smiling when you read that long title. I think it's a long thing to simply say that I love building cultures where people thrive. Yeah, we need to be more human-centric.
In short, yes. And that's so important. I love that. And that today's conversation, I think, ties straight into that, right? From both our sides, I know that you come from a very experienced HR background, and so it's been part of your world for so long. And I just recently, in the last 6 months, created a wonderful unconscious bias program, and I thought, who better to have a chat about this, just to solidify what this is. And I just want to sort of preface this with the meaning of what biases is. And unconscious bias is a disproportionate weight in favor of or against an idea or thing, which is usually in the way that is closed-minded, prejudicial. It's a very good word for me, prejudicial or unfair. Biases can be innate or learned. Very important to know that they innate in us, or they can be learned. And people may develop biases for or against an individual, a group, or a belief. In science and engineering, a bias is a systematic error, right? And I think that is such a good way to sort of preface it, so that we can understand that a bias is a thing that humans do instinctively. And if you're human, you have a bias. You may not be aware of the bias, completely unconscious, but essentially it is about, we all have biases. So to kick it off, Anja, what is a bias and when are we not biased?
So I was listening to that formal definition that you've shared with us, and I thought, okay, let me see if I can position it in a different way. So to the question, when are we not biased? I have to say never. I think we're always biased. And as you say, Kevin, sometimes we're just not conscious about that. So I think whenever we talk about this topic of biases, I think it's that awareness that we create is the first step. That's not the only step, but I think it's an important one. So when you mention biases, where I actually use the concept of biases even more than in my HR career was when I started to support businesses to be more agile. And especially from a leadership perspective, to understand how those biases might influence us. And I think for me then, when I think of a bias, it's a mental model. And what is a mental model? As you said, it's those engraved either stories or assumptions or beliefs that we have about the world. And I think, as you've mentioned, a bias it's almost like that automatic tool that we need to navigate this complex world that we live in. So that in short for me is what a bias is all about.
So on that point, I want to just from a NLP perspective, just to give some reference to what your brain's doing, right? So right now you're an external event. You're not happening in my head. I'm your external event, and essentially what my brain's doing is I need to start gathering and picking up information, and I do that via my senses, right? It's my filter system. I get reality into my head via my senses. The one thing that we don't know, and what we're not cognitively aware or consciously aware of, is that your subconscious is picking up all of it, right? Your subconscious is literally, it's listening to the bird that's whistling outside my window. It's listening to the traffic in the road. It's listening to the dogs barking down there in the distance. But actively, consciously, my brain's not focused there, based on the fact that it's focused on the thing that I'm busy with. And this is where the shortcuts come in, right? The biases really come in, is my brain's literally filtering information. It's generalizing, distorting, and deleting. And in the distortion of what my brain's doing is where my biases kick into gear, because I'll go, well, this is something to make sense of all of that consciously. I need to make it smaller. And if I can distort it to that degree, I can go, oh, I've seen this before. It might be something similar, or I've experienced something similar. So let's create a bias, because that's shortcuts your brain to this is evidence to prove that I know this is the key conversation around that is, because your brain is doing that, you most absolutely definitely have a bias.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
When I see to give you a simple example, like we have great conversations, and I don't know if I even consciously have this bias, but because you're a white person, I'm a white person, we immediately have an affinity bias. Immediately. Right. And that just presupposes that because we're both white, because we come out of South Africa, because we have an Afrikaans background, there's so many presupposed moments that attach to that very bias. We instinctively have the bias of affinity based on the fact that we're both white. Yeah. Right. But what we don't realize is that very instinctive thing that we're doing there could lead to a biased decision-making process, right? So you also have to see how is that very affinity bias that I do have playing into my decision-making process. And that's why it's so important to be able to have these conversations in a work environment. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Kevin, just to build on what you've mentioned about what's happening for us, and I think it's to add on to that is just for our listeners to remember that when you look at a situation, and if we talk about this complex world, it's really the bias, I almost want to say, is there for 4 reasons. As you've mentioned, there's an information overload. There's just so much going on. And as you've rightfully said, we try to filter and reduce that. I think the second thing that we're also trying to do without even noticing that is that there's a lack of meaning, and we're trying to fill in those gaps. And exactly like you say, because there's perhaps a lack of meaning, I've done that before. And I mean, as you said, most of this happening unconscious. And then thirdly, also in this, I almost want to call it the VUCA world. We need to act fast. And sometimes when you need to make decisions, it has to happen on the fly. And that's also why some of the biases exist. And then I think that whole thing about what do I need to remember, because there's so much going on and because there's so much information, what do I need to remember to making it easier for me next time? And I mean, you've mentioned now, the two of us being similar, perhaps both white, whatever, but whatever we have in common. And I mean, that's our bias to automatically group to that individual. What I also see is sometimes when people brainstorm and someone is putting forward an idea, to build on that one is now I like that idea because I like you perhaps a little bit more. And again, especially for a leader, need to understand and be aware that my feelings might frame my judgment towards that idea. So immediately need to ask ourselves, so if that same idea is coming from someone else, would I have responded the same way? Would I have asked more questions? What would have been different? And I think that is, as you say, so important for us to really be very careful and mindful of what is really happening in the moment.
And also to recognize that because we have those biases, maybe ask someone who's unlike me, someone who's different than me, someone who's maybe a different sex, a different color, a different age, to kind of go, is there a question that I'm not asking? Is there something here that I'm not aware of? Yeah. And just framing that and letting people sort of go, yeah, but what about this? Yeah. You're instinctively opening the door to curb and mitigate your own biases based on the fact that you are aware that because you're a human, you have bias, right? And I
Yeah.
think it's so important, especially in the workplace, to be able to frame that and to have that awareness and be able to share that. How do I open this conversation up more for people to unpack it even further?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that reminder of why an open-ended question is so powerful. Remember when we had our discussion on leaders as coaches, it was very similar to say
Yeah,
that if you now have this diverse group sitting in front of you, how can we connect neocortex to neocortex is by asking an open-ended question. But I love that tip where you say, let me ask someone else that I know is diverse, being it background, race, culture, whatever. Let me get their input and view on the table. Yeah, absolutely.
what I do want to share is some of the like the obvious examples that come to play in a workplace, and I'm sure you've seen this a lot. Is one of them we've mentioned the affinity bias. Another one is the attribution bias. So we attribute certain kinds of things or certain kinds of people or certain kind of degrees. You know, if a person has a degree, then instinctively we make that we attribute something. Whatever I do in my head, we attribute it. It must mean this, right? And I think when we do that, it already creates a shortfall because we're creating a moment that we're almost making a judgment before we've actually spoken or met the person or spent time with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the example that I often use about the attribution bias is, let's say it was still the world of face-to-face meetings and we were stuck in traffic, and then your colleague is late or one of your team members is late for the meeting. So what do? We attribute their late coming and we judge them
Yeah.
based on their behavior. But
Yes.
if you were late yourself for the meeting, it is also you judge yourself based on your intention. So I know that I'm late because my kid were ill and I had to first drop them off and talk to the teacher. But when you are late, it's because you're not motivated or you're not committed. And I think, again, that's such an important one to be aware of, that when I judge you, it's based on your behavior. But if I judge myself, it is my intention was good. It's not the situation. And I think, again, just to give the learners the tip of, now what do you do now that you're aware of that bias? And again, ask yourself a question. So yeah, I quite like the one saying, why would a reasonable, rational and decent person do that? Because again, it would open up your mind to that example that I've used.
Another one that really stands out, and I think when I first did the research on this, what was really interesting about a gender bias is there are certain certain studies that show that with a gender bias, we even attribute height, the height of a person, right, and especially the height of a male, to be more executive and more in charge than the height of a female, right? Which when you listen to that logically, you process that and you're going, what the what? You know,
Yeah.
you kind of like, is that even a thing? But unconsciously, remember, guys, we're speaking about unconscious bias. So unconscious bias really speaks to in our brains because, and the reason apparently for the psychology shows is that when we got a lot of advice from people when we were growing up, we would look up. We would literally look up to our teachers and look up to our parents and look up. So we instinctively made looking up to people in charge, right? And yet it's got nothing to do with whether this person is capable of doing the job or not, right? Gender's gender, you know, it's irrelevant of
Yeah.
being able to handle a position.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is why the two questions that I usually share as tips for any situation, because I mean, we started the conversation saying that we never ever not bias. And I
Yeah.
think for us then to remember that the two questions might be is what is really going on in the moment? I mean, being, as you say, you might be judging someone coming for an interview based on their height, or you might be judging someone based on their gender, and also what is really happening there. So I think that is why it's so critical for, I'm saying leaders, but actually for all of us to be mindfully present in that moment. Another word that I sometimes use for biases is mind traps, because it's your mind trapping you to believe something.
Yeah.
And the one that I often see, and I don't know if you heard about that one, but it's the mind trap of, I almost want to say, agreement. Because as you know, one of our basic human needs are that sense of belonging. I want to belong to a team. I want to make a meaningful contribution. And then the mind trap of agreement is that sometimes in teams we have that artificial harmony because we agree so that we're part of the group. And I often see that whole, I almost want to say, value of speaking up, that value of, creating that psychological safety that we can disagree with a leader or share my honest feedback or opinion. And I think it links so beautifully with that mind trap of agreement, that we don't want to have the good conversations and perhaps understand that an argument or conflict might actually benefit us in that moment. Yeah, that's also one that I often see.
One that I do want to mention, and it's the last one I just want to point out on the biases, and I want to chat to you about how do we mitigate these biases. But the last one that's so important, that was so important in one of the trainings that I did, was a pessimism bias. And I just want to read to you the sort of the outline of this. Is the pessimism bias refers to the tendency to overestimate the likelihood of negative events while underestimating the likelihood of positive events. I think that currently South Africa and a large part of what we're going through in this country is really playing into our pessimism bias, because of the government, because of load shedding, because of crime, because of it's there's so much evidence to prove the contrary, right? That we are almost in a pessimistic bias, caught up because of the likelihood of something going wrong, that it's affecting us to the degree that I don't want to get out of bed because it's just another day that's gonna go wrong, or something bad's gonna happen. And we were talking about this in the training, and one of the senior managers said to me, yeah, but remember, you always have to be you have to make sure that you've got to be planned for the worst case scenario. I said to him, no, I get that. That's being, like, you're making sure that you're not going to fail here. But I said to him, careful that you're not literally teaching your guys to show up for what could go wrong, because you're not teaching them for what could go right. Right? You're literally framing your solution around what could go wrong, and you're not even opening up the door of conversation or possible action or agreement to what could go right. So when you get stuck in your pessimism bias, everything becomes pessimistic. Everything, and you'll add evidence to prove the reality of why this is so bad and why this is so wrong. But careful that it doesn't become the habit-formed process of your thinking patterns, because then you're just planning for what's wrong, and you're not planning for the potential possibility of what could be going right.
Yeah.
It's really a brain frame that people get stuck in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what comes to mind for me there is a few things. So the first of all is, what habits or rituals are we cultivating in my team or cultivating in my organization? And I think, as you say, for any business savvy individual, it is good to have a look at, okay, but what can go wrong, and have a look and plan accordingly, or have at least 2 or 3 scenario plannings, because, we don't know what we don't know. But what I like and want to build on what you've mentioned is twofold. So on the one side, if we have a look at neuroscience and we think of that springboard for high performance energy, what do we know? Springboard for high performance energy, and it's the energy to unlock your high performance, is optimism. It is something like humor. It is something like doing charity as a group. Now, just that word, optimism. Another one is gratitude, just to be cognizant of what, or just highlighting or writing down what you're grateful for. So that's the one thing that comes to mind, that, yes, I think a good thing is to get into that habit of, what are we grateful for today? to counter that. So that's the first thing. But then also on the second side is what I have seen so often. And I don't know if it's a South African thing. Surely not. I think it is a global thing. But that because we want to be optimistic, I think South Africans sometimes, what you want to see the silver lining is that we don't acknowledge or we don't allow ourselves just that negative, I want to call it an emotion. So you mentioned that, being pessimistic, but for me, it's almost like it is okay not to be okay. And in this situation, it is okay to have that view, yet we should support ourselves to get out of there because we know that the optimism behind the neuroscience is so important.
And just one little point on, and I think we touched on in the beginning, but biases are not a bad thing. And yeah, like I think the word, people have such a negative conversation when you say, well, is this a bias? Is my biases playing into this? And they instinctively go to this negative space. Bias is like having a brain. The fact that you have a brain it's not negative or positive. It's just the fact that you have a brain. Biases is exactly the same thing. You have biases. How you're aware of them and how you actively are learned about them will really help you sort of enforce and reinforce and bring towards the fore of how you show up as a leader, how you show up as an employee. You have to be aware of the fact that you will have a bias. It's just, is this working in your favor or is it not working in your favor? I have a bias against negative people. Like, I don't want to be around negative people, and that's a bias that serves me really, really well, so, and that's a good thing, so biases are not bad. They're there for a very good reason, for your brain to do good things for you. You just have to be aware of how they're playing out.
Yeah, and I think if you go back to the four examples that I've mentioned about, there's a lack of meaning, there's an overflow of information, we need to make decisions quickly, and we need to think what we need to remember. And again, as you say, the whole function is to save energy, to support you, as you say, with your to how your brain optimally function. But I think, again, just to mention or to add on to what you just said, is that remember that when we bias, we don't necessarily see everything. Or when we make a decision, we need to make a snap decision, and that decision might be flawed. Or it might be that if we just, if we have to go back on previous decisions that we made or previous memories, it can be skewed. But as you say, I think that the most important part is for us to be aware of them and not necessarily think they're all good or all bad. It is. So what do I need to be mindful of in that moment? So as you've mentioned, it was not necessarily a bad thing.
Now, just to end it off today, I want to sort of just touch on just how 5 critical steps to improve on mitigating bias, and I'm just going to read them and jump in wherever you feel free. Step number 1: make sure your employees understand stereotyping, the foundation for bias, and educate your employees about stereotyping so you can raise the awareness. Such a necessary point, because people kind of, they still have it as that tick box exercise and say, inclusivity and all that good stuff, we've got it covered. But is it in your language? Is it in your values? Is it really showing up? And I think raising the awareness is so important, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
The second one is set expectations. Let employees know that you are prioritizing bias mitigation. Begin by using relevant terminology and making sure employees understand the company values diversity, inclusion, and equity. I think, again, it's through education, right? The way that we understand bias is really by educating the employees to that degree, and to know that this is not a, oh, be careful conversation. This is a necessary conversation.
Absolutely. And what word came to mind when you read that one was the whole thing of what's our narrative. So when we talk about values, when we talk about beliefs, it's really, so what's the words, what's that common language that we would agree on, but also what is the behavior that is a expected behavior. So as you say, let's cultivate that awareness and not upliftment. What's the word I'm looking for? But cultivate that understanding. Yes, this is what we stand for, and this is what the language we use.
Another big one that stands out is be transparent about your hiring and promotion process. I can't emphasize this enough, right? People really, they'll go to racism, sexism, ageism. They'll go to every kind of ism that they can find when your process of hiring and promotion isn't transparent. As an HR executive, you've learned, you can speak to that quite clearly.
Absolutely. And I think the one that stands out is not only on the hiring side, because it might be that we, appoint externally, and that usually is quite a transparent process, but that promotion one. And I mean, if you just have a look at succession planning and who's high potential and who's not, and is the list a secret or not? And I think, as you say, just open up that transparency, that people know what are we looking for, why are certain people in the, on the list or not. But more importantly, that in agile organizations, what we see more and more is where teams select managers. So it's not only the process that is selecting the manager, but let's involve team members in deciding, okay, so who will be appointed next as our manager? But yeah, absolutely, transparency is the first principle that we need to focus on.
Another one, we've got two more, and then I'm finished. Then we're finished for today. But make leaders responsible. Ensuring decision makers are accountable for organization values will demonstrate the importance of unbiased workplace to organization culture. I think, it goes without saying, if you're an executive, if you're a leader listening to this today, if you're not actively educating yourself about unconscious bias and really showing up in your behaviors, your actions, your cultures, your words, your theme, your DNA of running your business, the buck stops by you. That's where that really has to start, by leadership showing up for that organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's similar to let's walk the talk. I mean, we can't practice or we can't preach what we don't practice. And I think it's really in the small thing. I remember you were mentioning diversity and inclusion earlier on. But I mean, if you look at the South African context, so if you think of diversity, inclusion, and belonging, is it a tick box exercise for you in your leadership team? Or is it something that you really understand I almost want to say the heart behind that? And that is where biases definitely has a part to play, that awareness and understanding.
I just as a side note, as a gay man, I working in a corporate, I've been in a boardroom where nobody in the boardroom was gay, and I knew this because nobody in the organization said, like, as gay people in our organization, we're kind of quite fearful about coming out because we're not even represented at board level. Right. So as much as it's a color thing, as it's a sexist thing, as it's a ageist thing, there's so many that you've really actively as leaders got to be consciously aware of. Does my board really represent us inclusively? And is that world class? How do we measure that at world class level? And until we actively get into that frame, that brain framing of going, well, I need to find someone who fills this role for me, that is representative of these types of people or this area of people in my organization. It's still not inclusive, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as you say, that's definitely a conversation for another day. But just thinking of, if you talk about representation, so many organizations still are just trying to get the females, on board, as you say, not even thinking of all the other minorities or groups that we have not even spoken about in that environment.
Yeah, so important. And the last one I just want to touch on is have clear criteria for evaluating qualification and performance. Having such criteria eliminates nearly all possibilities that bias will impact the appraisal process. Some companies use blind evaluations so that the employee is represented solely by their work and not their race or their gender. which I think is a really great idea, because then you just have this information of this wonderful person sitting in front of you. You don't know what color they are. You don't know what their name is. You don't know what sex they are. You don't know any of that. You just have evidence of the ability of the human sitting in front of you, because that's what it is. It's seeing a human for being human, right? And then making a decision on, I have 5 human CVs in front of me. Which one stands out to me? And then having, taking it further. I think being human around biases is one of the most important things that I think people miss often.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned the appraisal process, and I think that is really a conversation for another day, because if you think of performance appraisal, just 2 short things. That continuous feedback, that's why it's so important that when something happened, I immediately provide you with feedback. I don't wait for our quarterly or annual check-in to discuss that. That's the first thing. And then secondly, to really think, why are we doing performance reviews? What is the purpose? Because in the agile way of work, we take away that rating part, because if it's about developing the individual as a focus, and not only to get a list of how will we pay bonuses or how will we do increases, that's where the value lies, because we build these learning organizations. But yeah, my last 2 cents on biases, just ask yourself what's really happening in the moment and be mindfully present, because we are biased, and that is okay, because we're human. But now that you have that awareness to say in each and every moment, what's really happening, what's really the situation, then see if that question is not opening up your mind to remove some of the biases.
Absolutely. And from my side, summary for today is just be a human. I think that stands out for me, and make space, create space for the other human in the room, or the other humans in the room, just to see them as human and hear them and pay attention and make space for them. I think it's so important. Anja, thank you so much for today's conversation. I absolutely love our conversations.
Yeah, that's a ditto from my side. Thank you, and loving as well. Thanks, Kevin.
Guys, so if you want to get hold of us, we're going to put all our links in the description boxes below, and we're on all our social medias. Anja's also got a wonderful Instagram account, and she's on LinkedIn. So go and check it out. It's Anja van Beek and Kevin Britz from Leadership by Design. So thank you, and chat to you in a month's time.
Goodbye.
Cheers for now.